"Don't bother setting the table, Margaret," Ashley had texted that morning. "We're already celebrating Christmas without you." Margaret Whitmore read the message while the oven timer hummed softly in the quiet kitchen, and for a long moment she simply stood there, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, as if the house itself had paused to hear what she would do next. The turkey was nearly finished roasting, the skin turning a careful golden brown the way her late husband Robert had always liked it, and the smell of sage, butter, and slow-cooked onions filled the small Vermont farmhouse she had lived in for more than 40 years. Outside the window, the December snow drifted down in slow white ribbons, covering the driveway she had cleared earlier that afternoon because she had been certain, absolutely certain, that Daniel and the children would arrive before sunset. Margaret had woken before sunrise that morning, the same way she had every Christmas since her son was a boy. She had measured flour for the rolls, stirred cranberries into a pot of sugar and orange peel, and polished the old silverware that had belonged to Robert's mother. The dining room table was set for 6 people, each plate carefully spaced on the dark oak surface, each glass reflecting the glow of the tree lights from the living room. 2 hours earlier, she had checked her phone for the first time that afternoon and noticed a new post from Ashley. The photo showed Daniel and the grandchildren standing in matching sweaters in front of a giant Christmas tree somewhere bright and expensive. A ski resort, judging by the snow-covered mountains in the background. Ashley stood beside them, smiling broadly at the camera, holding a mug of hot chocolate like someone who had planned the perfect holiday moment. The caption read, "Perfect Christmas with Family." Margaret stared at the picture for a long time, noticing every small detail. The matching sweaters, the red scarves, the bright decorations behind them. What struck her most was not that she had been left out of the trip. It was that no one had told her it was happening. She placed the phone slowly on the kitchen counter and returned her attention to the oven. The timer beeped once, sharp and cheerful, announcing that the turkey was ready. Margaret slipped on a pair of worn oven mitts and opened the oven door. A wave of warm air rushed into the quiet room. She lifted the heavy pan and set it carefully on the stovetop, the metal rack clinking softly under the weight. Steam rose into the air, carrying the scent of roasted herbs and butter. The house was completely silent except for the low crackle of the fireplace in the next room. For 35 years, Margaret had hosted Christmas dinner in this house. Daniel used to run down the hallway in his pajamas while Robert carved the turkey and teased him for trying to steal the first slice. Later, when Ashley married into the family, she had once told Margaret that no restaurant in Vermont could cook a holiday meal the way she could. That had been years ago. Margaret picked up her phone again, her fingers steady, and looked once more at the photograph Ashley had posted. The grandchildren were laughing, their cheeks red from the cold mountain air. Daniel stood behind them with his arm around Ashley's shoulder. Margaret studied the image carefully, noticing how perfectly framed everything looked. Perfect smiles, perfect lighting, perfect family. She set the phone down again and glanced toward the dining room, where the 6 empty chairs waited patiently around the table. The candles were already lit. Their flames flickered gently in the quiet house as the winter evening slowly settled outside. Margaret Whitmore carried the roasting pan to the dining table with slow, steady hands and placed it carefully at the center of the white linen cloth she had ironed that morning. The candles flickered gently beside it, casting soft reflections across the polished silverware and the empty glasses waiting beside every plate. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking at the 6 chairs she had arranged earlier in the afternoon. 1 chair for Daniel, 1 for Ashley, 2 for the grandchildren, 1 for herself, and the last one, the seat that had belonged to Robert for more than 3 decades, remained quietly pushed in as if he might still walk through the door at any moment and take his place with that familiar half-smile he used to wear every Christmas evening. Margaret reached for the carving knife and began slicing the turkey the way she always had, careful and precise, each slice even and neat. The sound of the blade moving through the crisp skin and tender meat echoed softly in the still house. When she finished, she placed the knife down and looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7:15 in the evening. The snow outside had grown heavier, thick white flakes drifting past the kitchen window and settling along the edge of the porch railing. Normally by this time the house would be filled with noise. Daniel used to arrive early with the children, their boots thumping loudly across the wooden floor as they ran inside to see the presents under the tree. Ashley would bring dessert and stand in the doorway with a bright smile, praising the smell of dinner even before she took off her coat. Margaret could almost hear those sounds now, faint echoes of memories that belonged to another year. Her phone vibrated again on the table beside the gravy bowl. She picked it up slowly and saw another photograph posted online. The same ski resort. The same bright decorations. This time the children were standing beside a massive outdoor fireplace while snow drifted gently behind them. Daniel held a cup of cocoa in one hand. Ashley stood close beside him, wrapped in a thick white scarf, smiling toward the camera with the same careful expression she always used for photographs. Beneath the picture was another caption. Christmas magic with the people who matter most. Margaret read the sentence twice, her eyes moving slowly across each word. Then she set the phone down again beside her plate. The turkey continued to cool on the table, the steam fading into the quiet air. Margaret walked into the living room and stood beside the Christmas tree she had decorated the night before. The ornaments were the same ones she had collected over the years, small glass figures from family vacations, wooden stars Robert had carved by hand, and the fragile silver bell Daniel had made in elementary school when he was 8 years old. She reached out and touched the bell gently, listening to the faint sound it made as it swayed from the branch. For a long moment she stood there, looking at the tree, the lights reflecting softly in the window beside it. Then she turned and walked back toward the dining room. The table was still waiting exactly the way she had arranged it. 6 plates, 6 chairs, 6 folded napkins. Margaret sat down in her own seat at the end of the table. She folded her hands quietly in her lap and listened to the silence that filled the old house, the same house where every Christmas for 35 years had once been loud with family voices. And somewhere across the state, beneath bright resort lights and perfect holiday decorations, her family continued smiling for photographs that would never show the empty chair waiting for them here. Margaret Whitmore remained seated at the long dining table while the candle flames slowly shortened beside the untouched plates. The turkey rested at the center of the table, carved and neatly arranged, but the warm steam that had filled the room earlier had faded into the quiet air. Outside, the snowfall continued steadily across the Vermont countryside, coating the road and the empty driveway with another thin layer of white. Margaret glanced once more toward the front window, as if she expected headlights to appear at the end of the long gravel lane, but the darkness outside remained undisturbed. She stood up after several minutes and began clearing the table one plate at a time. The sound of porcelain touching porcelain echoed softly through the dining room. She wrapped the unused rolls in foil and placed them carefully inside the refrigerator beside the cranberry sauce she had prepared that morning. The refrigerator door closed with a quiet click, and the small kitchen light reflected gently across the polished floorboards that Robert had refinished many years ago. Margaret paused beside the counter and looked toward the hallway where the old family photographs hung in simple wooden frames. There was one picture taken on Christmas Day nearly 20 years earlier. Daniel was 12 years old in that photograph, standing proudly beside the Christmas tree with a new baseball glove he had opened that morning. Robert stood behind him with one hand resting on his son's shoulder, smiling in the calm way he always had whenever the house was filled with family. Margaret had taken that photograph herself with a small camera she kept in the kitchen drawer. She remembered that day clearly. Snow had fallen that morning as well, but the house had been full of noise and laughter. She remembered Daniel asking for a second slice of pie and Robert pretending to argue that there would be none left for dessert. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long moment before turning back toward the kitchen. Her phone rested quietly on the table beside the sink. When she picked it up again, another notification appeared on the screen. Ashley had posted yet another image from the ski resort. This one showed the entire family gathered around a large outdoor dinner table surrounded by glowing holiday lights. The children were holding plates of food, while Daniel leaned forward slightly toward the camera. Ashley stood beside him with a bright smile, one hand resting lightly on his arm as the picture was taken. Beneath the photo, another line of text appeared. Holiday dinner with the people who truly make life special. Margaret read the caption slowly, then placed the phone down beside the sink. The house remained silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle crackling of the fire in the living room. She walked back toward the dining table and looked once more at the chair that had belonged to Robert. The candle beside it had nearly burned down to the bottom of the glass holder. Margaret reached forward and quietly blew out the flame. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward into the still air. Then she stood there for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the back of the empty chair, while the quiet farmhouse settled deeper into the long winter night. Morning arrived slowly over the Whitmore farmhouse, pale winter lights spreading across the snow-covered fields beyond the kitchen window. Margaret Whitmore woke before the sun fully cleared the tree line, the same way she had done for most of her life, and for a moment she lay quietly beneath the heavy quilt listening to the familiar sounds of the old house. The furnace clicked on in the basement. Wind brushed softly against the porch railing outside. Somewhere in the distance a truck passed along the county road, its tires crunching over frozen gravel. Margaret sat up slowly and slipped her feet into the wool slippers waiting beside the bed. The hallway felt cool as she walked toward the kitchen, the wooden floorboards creaking gently beneath each step. When she reached the doorway, she paused for a moment and looked around the room. The dishes from the night before had already been washed and placed carefully on the drying rack beside the sink. The table was empty again, the white cloth folded neatly and placed back in the drawer where she kept the holiday linens. Only the Christmas tree lights from the living room cast a soft glow across the kitchen floor. Margaret filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove. As the burner warmed, she stood beside the counter and glanced toward the phone resting near the window. Several new notifications had appeared overnight. Ashley had continued posting photographs from the ski resort. Margaret opened the first image. The grandchildren were standing beside a wooden lodge covered in bright holiday lights. Their jackets looked new, bright red and blue against the snow behind them. Daniel stood nearby holding a pair of skis while Ashley leaned toward the children with the same careful smile she used in every photograph. Margaret studied the image quietly before opening the next one. This picture showed the family gathered inside a large restaurant decorated with pine garlands and gold ornaments. Plates of food covered the table in front of them. Ashley had written another short caption beneath the picture. "The best holiday dinner we have ever had." Margaret set the phone down again without reacting. The kettle began to whistle softly on the stove. She poured hot water into a small ceramic mug and carried it to the living room where the Christmas tree still stood beside the window. The ornaments shimmered gently in the morning light. Margaret sat down in the old armchair Robert used to favor and wrapped both hands around the warm mug. For several minutes, she simply watched the snow falling outside the window. The driveway remained empty, untouched except for the path she had cleared the day before. Across the room, a stack of wrapped gifts still waited beneath the tree. Each one carried a small handwritten tag with the grandchildren's names written carefully in blue ink. Margaret looked at the presents for a long moment before standing up and walking toward the hallway. At the far end of the corridor stood the small study Robert had used during the last years of his life. The door remained closed most days, but this morning Margaret turned the brass handle and stepped inside. Dusty sunlight filtered through the tall window beside the desk. The shelves were lined with old paperwork, neatly organized folders, and several thick binders Robert had kept for the family finances. Margaret moved slowly toward the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside rested a folder she had not touched in several months. She lifted it carefully and placed it on the desk surface. For a moment, she stood there with her hand resting on the cover while the quiet room held the weight of years of memories. Outside the window, the snow continued falling across the fields, covering the land in a wide, silent blanket. Margaret opened the folder and began reading the first page, her expression calm and thoughtful as the morning light grew brighter around her. Margaret Whitmore remained standing beside the old desk while the morning light slowly brightened the study around her. The folder lay open before her, several neatly typed pages resting beneath the protective plastic sleeves Robert had used to keep everything organized. Margaret moved one page carefully to the side and continued reading. The documents listed the ownership of the Whitmore property in clear legal language. The farmhouse, the surrounding land that stretched nearly 30 acres behind the tree line. The small barn Robert had rebuilt during the last years of his life. All of it was recorded under Margaret Whitmore's name. Robert had insisted on that arrangement long before he became ill, explaining in his calm, practical way that the land should remain protected no matter what happened in the future. Margaret remembered that conversation clearly. It had taken place at this same desk on a quiet autumn evening while the maple leaves drifted across the backyard outside the window. Robert had closed the folder after signing the papers and told her that land had a way of revealing who truly cared about family and who only cared about ownership. Margaret rested her hand lightly on the open page and allowed the memory to settle for a moment before closing the folder again. The house remained silent around her. From the kitchen came the faint ticking sound of the old wall clock, marking the slow movement of the morning. Margaret carried the folder back to the desk drawer and placed it inside with the same careful precision Robert had always used when storing important papers. When she closed the drawer, she noticed another envelope resting near the back of the compartment. The envelope was addressed in Robert's handwriting. Margaret hesitated for a moment before lifting it out and turning it over in her hands. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the ink remained clear and steady. Her name was written across the front in simple blue pen. Margaret sat down in the chair beside the desk and opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. She unfolded it and began reading. The letter was short, written in Robert's familiar steady style. He had written it during the final months of his life, explaining that families often change in ways that cannot be predicted. People grow closer or drift apart depending on the choices they make. Robert had written that Margaret should never feel obligated to hold the family together if others chose to walk away. The responsibility for respect, he explained, always belonged to every member of the family, not just one person. Margaret read the letter twice before placing it gently back into the envelope. Outside the study window, the snowfall had begun to slow, leaving the fields covered in a wide blanket of white that stretched across the quiet landscape. Margaret stood and walked toward the window, looking out across the land Robert had loved so deeply. In the distance, the barn roof rose above the snow like a small dark shape against the pale sky. For many years, Margaret had believed that her role was simple. She had kept the house warm. She had cooked the meals. She had welcomed everyone back every holiday without asking questions. But as she stood there watching the winter morning settle across the fields, a different understanding slowly formed in her thoughts. Robert had not left these papers behind by accident. He had trusted her to make decisions when the time arrived. Margaret remained at the window for several minutes before turning back toward the desk. The quiet farmhouse felt different now, not lonely but thoughtful, as if the house itself understood that something important had shifted during the long silent night that had just passed. Margaret Whitmore closed the study door behind her and walked slowly back toward the kitchen, the quiet rhythm of the house following her down the narrow hallway. The kettle had long since cooled on the stove, and the morning light now filled the room more brightly than before, reflecting softly across the snow that stretched across the backyard fields. Margaret placed the envelope back inside the drawer beside the other documents and paused for a moment, with her hand resting against the wooden surface of the desk. Robert's handwriting remained clear in her memory, steady and thoughtful, exactly the way he had spoken when explaining something important. Families change in ways that cannot be predicted. Those words stayed with her as she moved through the kitchen and poured the rest of her tea down the sink. Outside, the wind had begun to shift slightly, pushing small waves of snow along the edges of the fence that bordered the Whitmore land. Margaret stepped onto the back porch and looked across the quiet acres that had belonged to the family for nearly 2 generations. The barn stood motionless near the far side of the field, its weathered red boards dark against the pale snow. Robert had repaired that barn himself many years earlier, climbing the ladder slowly while Daniel handed him tools from the ground below. Margaret could still picture the two of them laughing when a hammer slipped from Robert's hand and landed in the grass. That had been long before Daniel grew older and moved into a different rhythm of life, one shaped by travel, work, and eventually Ashley's constant search for the perfect image of family happiness. Margaret remained on the porch for several minutes while the cold winter air brushed gently across her face. The farmhouse behind her felt steady and familiar, every creaking floorboard and quiet hallway carrying the memory of decades of ordinary days. She turned and stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind her. On the kitchen counter, her phone rested exactly where she had left it earlier that morning. The screen lit up again with another notification. Ashley had posted a short video this time, showing the grandchildren laughing beside a wide stone fireplace, while Daniel poured hot chocolate into large mugs. Holiday music played faintly in the background of the recording. Margaret watched the video once without expression before setting the phone down again. She noticed something different now. The camera moved quickly across the room in Ashley's recording, capturing decorations, smiling faces, and bright lights. But the scene felt carefully arranged, as if every moment had been chosen for display rather than for memory. Margaret understood that kind of performance. She had spent years quietly supporting family gatherings while others took photographs and shared them with the world. But the quiet realization that settled in her thoughts. This morning felt calm rather than painful. The farmhouse, the land, and the future of everything Robert had worked to build were not decisions that belonged to photographs or captions. They belonged to the person who had remained here through every season, every repair, every quiet winter morning. Margaret walked to the window again and looked across the snow-covered property stretching far beyond the fence line. The sky had cleared slightly, revealing a pale winter sun rising above the distant trees. Somewhere in the distance a lone crow crossed the open field, its wings cutting through the cold air before disappearing toward the forest edge. Margaret stood there watching the land for several moments longer, her expression steady and thoughtful, as the quiet understanding that had begun forming inside her continued to grow clearer with every passing minute. The next morning the Whitmore farmhouse stood beneath a pale blue winter sky, the storm from the night before leaving the entire property wrapped in a quiet blanket of snow. Margaret Whitmore moved slowly through the kitchen, placing a small cast iron pan on the stove while sunlight filtered across the wooden floorboards. The house felt different now, not emptier, but steadier, as if the long silence of the previous evening had settled something inside the old walls. Margaret cracked 2 eggs into the pan and watched them cook while the radio on the counter played a soft country song from a local Vermont station. She rarely listened to the radio during the holidays, but this morning the quiet music seemed to fit the calm rhythm of the house. Outside the window a pair of deer moved carefully along the edge of the field, their hooves leaving delicate tracks in the untouched snow. Margaret finished breakfast, washed the plate, and dried it with the same slow precision she had used for years. When she finished, she walked down the hallway toward the small study again, her steps calm and unhurried. The room looked exactly as it had the day before. Robert's desk sat near the window, the shelves lined with binders and old folders organized in his familiar methodical way. Margaret opened the desk drawer and removed the folder containing the property documents once more. She carried it to the desk and placed it in front of her before sitting down in the chair Robert had used for so many evenings of quiet paperwork. The winter sun fell across the open pages as she reviewed the details again. The house, the 30 acres of land, the barn, and the surrounding fields. Everything had been carefully secured years earlier under Margaret's ownership. Robert had explained that decision simply at the time. Land should remain in the hands of the person who understands its value. Margaret closed the folder again and leaned back in the chair, her thoughts steady. The photographs Ashley continued posting online told a very different story of family life. Smiling faces beside decorated fireplaces. Holiday dinners captured in bright restaurant light. Perfect moments designed to look warm and welcoming to anyone scrolling past them on a phone screen. But the Whitmore farmhouse held a different kind of history. The creaking staircase Daniel had run down as a boy on Christmas mornings. The porch railing Robert had replaced after a harsh winter storm. The long summer evenings when the grandchildren once chased fireflies in the tall grass behind the barn. Margaret stood and walked to the window beside the desk. From there she could see the entire stretch of land rolling gently toward the distant line of maple trees. A thin path cut through the snow where the old tractor tracks remained from autumn. Robert had always said the land was patient. It waited quietly while people argued, changed, or drifted away from one another. Margaret understood that now more clearly than ever. She returned to the desk and picked up the phone resting beside the folder. For a moment, she simply held it in her hand, looking at the blank screen. Then she opened her contact list and found the name she was searching for. Harold Bennett had been the Whitmore family attorney for nearly 20 years. He had handled Robert's estate papers, the land registration, and several other matters that required careful attention. Margaret pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear while the line rang. Outside the study window the winter sun climbed slowly above the fields, casting long shadows across the snow. When Harold finally answered the phone, Margaret spoke in the same calm voice she had used for decades while managing every detail of the household Robert had built. She explained that she would like to schedule a meeting in the coming days to review several documents related to the property and the future of the Whitmore land. Harold listened quietly before agreeing to meet her at his office the following week. Margaret thanked him and ended the call before placing the phone gently back on the desk. She looked once more across the quiet fields outside the window. The snow reflected the sunlight like a wide sheet of glass, bright and still. For the first time since the holiday began, Margaret felt a quiet certainty settle into place. The next chapter of the Whitmore family story would not be written through photographs or holiday captions. It would be written here, on the land that had watched every season of their lives pass across it, and Margaret Whitmore had finally decided how that story would continue. The following week arrived with clear skies and cold morning air stretching across the Whitmore property. Margaret Whitmore drove the short 12-mile trip into town just after sunrise, her old sedan moving steadily along the narrow Vermont road bordered by snow-covered pine trees. The small town of Brookfield looked quiet that morning, the storefronts still decorated with fading holiday lights that hung along the brick buildings of Main Street. Margaret parked near the courthouse square and stepped out of the car, pulling her wool coat closer around her shoulders before walking toward the law office she had visited many times over the years. Harold Bennett's office sat on the second floor of an older building overlooking the town green. The same brass plaque with his name still hung beside the door, polished neatly the way Harold always kept it. Margaret climbed the narrow staircase and knocked softly before stepping inside. Harold Bennett stood from behind his desk with a polite smile that carried the calm professionalism Margaret had always trusted. His gray hair had grown thinner since the last time she had seen him, but his careful attention to detail remained exactly the same. He invited Margaret to sit and asked if she would like coffee before they began reviewing the documents she had mentioned on the phone. Margaret declined the coffee and instead placed the folder from Robert's desk carefully on the table between them. Harold opened the folder slowly, reading through each page with the quiet concentration of a man who had spent decades studying contracts and land agreements. Outside the office window, the town square remained calm, the winter sunlight reflecting off the snow along the sidewalks. After several minutes, Harold looked up and adjusted his glasses. He confirmed that the documents Robert had prepared years earlier were still completely valid, and that the Whitmore property remained fully under Margaret's ownership. The farmhouse, the barn, and the surrounding land had all been secured in a way that gave Margaret complete authority over any future decisions involving the estate. Margaret listened quietly while Harold explained the options available to her. She could maintain the property exactly as it was. She could place the land into a family trust, or she could make other arrangements that would guide how the land would be used long after she was gone. Margaret remained silent for a moment before speaking in the same calm tone she had used on the phone the previous week. She explained that over the past several days she had spent time walking the property and remembering the many years she and Robert had spent building their life there. She described the barn Robert rebuilt, the maple trees he planted along the fence line, and the wide fields where Daniel once learned to drive the old tractor as a teenager. Harold listened carefully without interrupting while Margaret finished explaining her thoughts. When she finished, Harold nodded slowly and asked if she was certain about the direction she wanted to take. Margaret looked out the office window toward the quiet town square before answering. She explained that land carries memory, but it also carries responsibility. She believed the Whitmore property should continue serving a purpose that honored the life Robert had built rather than becoming something that existed only as a future inheritance waiting to be divided. Harold wrote several notes while she spoke, and then carefully closed the folder again. He assured Margaret that the legal steps required to move forward with her decision would not be difficult to arrange. Margaret thanked him and stood to leave the office, pausing briefly beside the window before stepping toward the door. Outside, the winter sun had climbed higher above the rooftops of Brookfield, and the quiet town moved slowly through another ordinary morning. As Margaret walked back toward her car, she felt the same calm certainty she had felt while standing in the study of the farmhouse days earlier. The photographs and captions shared online by others no longer held any weight over what she had decided. The future of the Whitmore land was now firmly in her hands, and she intended to guide it with the same steady care that had shaped every year of her life on that quiet Vermont property. 2 weeks later, the Whitmore farmhouse stood beneath another clear winter morning, the snow across the property beginning to soften under the pale January sunlight. Margaret Whitmore walked slowly along the narrow path leading from the back porch toward the barn, her boots pressing gentle marks into the thin layer of snow that remained across the field. The air carried that quiet stillness that often settled over Vermont after the holiday season ended, when the decorations disappeared from storefront windows and families returned to their ordinary routines. Margaret paused halfway across the yard and looked toward the long line of maple trees bordering the property. Their branches stood bare against the bright sky, waiting patiently for another spring. In the distance, the barn door creaked slightly in the breeze, the same familiar sound that had echoed across the land for years. Margaret opened the barn door and stepped inside. Sunlight slipped through the wooden slats, casting long narrow beams across the floor where Robert had once kept his tools and equipment neatly arranged along the wall. The old tractor remained parked near the back corner exactly where it had been left the previous autumn. Margaret rested her hand lightly against the wooden post beside the entrance and looked around the quiet space. Many winters earlier, Daniel had played in this barn, while Robert worked nearby repairing boards or organizing supplies. Margaret remembered the laughter that once filled this place, the sound of a young boy racing through piles of hay while his father pretended to chase him. Time had carried those years forward, slowly and steadily, just as the seasons moved across the land outside. Margaret stepped back into the sunlight and closed the barn door behind her. When she returned to the house, she noticed a car parked near the end of the driveway. Daniel stood beside it, brushing snow from his coat as he looked toward the farmhouse. Margaret walked toward him calmly. Daniel greeted her with an uncertain smile and explained that they had returned from the ski trip several days earlier. Ashley had been busy organizing photographs and sharing the highlights of the holiday with friends online. Daniel hesitated for a moment before admitting that he had not realized Margaret had spent the holiday evening alone until one of the grandchildren mentioned the gifts still waiting under her Christmas tree. Margaret listened quietly while Daniel spoke. The winter air carried the faint sound of wind across the open field behind them. After a moment, Daniel asked if everything was all right. Margaret nodded gently and explained that she had spent the past 2 weeks thinking carefully about the future of the property Robert had worked so hard to preserve. Daniel looked toward the wide fields stretching beyond the barn while she spoke. Margaret told him that she had already met with Harold Bennett and completed the legal arrangements for the Whitmore land. The farmhouse, the barn, and the 30 acres surrounding them would no longer remain a private family estate after her lifetime. Instead, the property would be placed into a small foundation designed to support widows in the local community who needed a place to rebuild their lives after loss. The house would provide temporary housing. The land would support small gardens and quiet spaces for those beginning again. Daniel remained silent for a long moment as he listened. Margaret's voice stayed calm and steady as she finished explaining her decision. She told him that families are built through presence and care, not photographs or captions shared with strangers. The land deserved to belong to people who understood that truth. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the snow beneath his boots. Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm and told him that he and the children would always be welcome to visit the farmhouse while she lived there. But the future of the land would now serve a purpose greater than inheritance. The winter sun climbed higher above the fields as they stood quietly beside the driveway. Across the property, the snow reflected the light in wide silver patches, and the Whitmore farmhouse stood calm and steady at the center of it all, holding the memories of the past while quietly preparing for the new purpose Margaret Whitmore had chosen for its future.